Hi, welcome to the Parenting Literacy Show. The purpose of this show is to provide information that parents can use to raise children who are healthy, intelligent, happy, spiritual, and have good social skills. My name is Dr. Joseph Lau. I'm a developmental psychologist who studied human development for more than 40 years. During the past 16 years, I've been studying parenting and how parents can best raise children. Today, I'd like to speak with you about a topic that has gotten a lot of attention in the media lately. And we have the good fortune of having with us Dr. Christia Brown, who happens to be one of the world's foremost experts on the topic. In fact, when we're asking people about whether they'd be interested in doing the interview, almost everybody we talked to said she's the person you've got to talk to. Right? And so even among her peers, she's recognized as an expert in the area. She's a developmental psychologist. She's the Lester and Helen Milledge Professor of Children at Risk in the Department of Psychology at the University of Kentucky. She's also the director of the Center for Equality and Social Justice at the University of Kentucky as well. She served as an expert witness for the American Civil Liberties Union on cases of gender discrimination in schools. She's published dozens of articles and now several books on this topic. And her book, Unraveling Bias, How Prejudice Has Shaped Children for Generations and Why It's Time to Break the Cycle, it just came out on November 31st. And so thank you for joining us today, and let's go ahead and get started. So the first question is a very general question. That is, what do we mean by racism?
Well, racism really occurs as kind of two threads at the same time. So there's structural racism. So as it relates to kids, it's the biases embedded in how school policies are shaped, how neighborhoods are segregated, how funding happens, what's in our textbooks and not in our textbooks. So those structural forms of racial inequalities. But racism is also often what we think more about, which is the kind of stereotyped attitudes, the prejudiced beliefs that we carry around in our hearts and minds that shape how we think about individuals.
Nice. Now, you mentioned attitudes and beliefs. I assume it also translates into actions.
It does. I mean, I think that's the main reason that we are concerned with racism is that the attitudes, if they were just self-contained, would be less problematic, but they come out in our behaviors. And so it leads to differential treatment of other people, which then affects them.
Yes. Now, you mentioned that there's structural racism. Is that similar to what is referred to popularly as systemic racism?
Yeah, I think we use those pretty interchangeably, kind of synonymously. It's the stuff that, I love the kind of the quote that it's, you can have racism without racist. Our system, particularly in America, but you see this pretty internationally, was designed to keep particularly whites in power and to give them greater resources. Those systems got entrenched. The laws were written by, white men in the US, for example. And so the laws and the policies and how things are funded and who's supported benefit them. And so unless we change those, that status quo continues to perpetrate racism without us doing anything in the here and now. So the status quo is one that's going to be based in racism. And so, yes, systemic or structural is that it's baked into the system, it's systemic, and it happens at kind of the systems level.
I see. Now, how can we recognize racism when we see it?
Well, I think we have to remember that racism is baked into almost all of the policies we have, and it's baked into most of the media that we have. So most of us walk around with racial biases, at least at an implicit level. So kind of the unconscious level, our brains made patterns because we watched biased media. So we are all walking around with racial biases embedded in our heads for the most part. And so oftentimes we have to be really mindful of behaviors because they might have biases coming out even. So I think the easy racism to see is the racial slurs, for example, right? That's the easy stuff. But most of it is much more subtle. It's what kind of assumptions are we making? Is someone treated slightly differently than someone else? Is someone given more space to be themselves than someone else? Are people given different access to opportunities than someone else? So I think we have to look at the big stuff and the small little kind of micro behaviors too.
I see. Now, is racism something that's inherited or is it more learned?
I think, as you know, with I think most things that we study in developmental psychology, it's both, right? I think the inherited part is we see that with infants. So I think if you see it in babies, there's probably something that's pretty inherited. What we do seem to be born with is this idea of the world is complicated. There's too many individual things to pay attention to. I want to sort and categorize as much as possible to kind of understand the world in an easier way, in a cognitively easier way. So what we see as humans pay attention to other humans. So when we're babies, they're paying attention to others. And we seem to pay attention to race, partly because it's really obvious part of our features, right? We differ by skin tone and hair texture and facial features. So babies are attuned to that really early. So that part seems to be, we're pretty hardwired to pay attention to people and categories. However, it would have no meaning if our society didn't attach meaning to it, right? Race is only meaningful because we have racial inequalities. And so what kids learn about those race categories is the learned part. It's what they see in media. It's what they overhear. It's the really subtle kinds of behaviors they're picking up from others. And then they extrapolate it and develop these biases around those race groups.
There's some interesting work by Bloom and his associates showing that even within the first few months of life, babies tend to discriminate between different people based on things like skin color. Mm-hmm. And so if I understand what you're saying, it's important for us to understand that there might be that kind of discrimination, but doesn't mean that the child has to learn to associate differences with deficiencies, for example, which is a common catchphrase.
Right. Like I think an analogy is babies can also, and you can also differentiate people based on things like hair color, right? We have categories of people that have brown hair and blonde hair and red hair and bald. And so we can see that visually, it's perceptually salient. But it's not meaningful. We don't assume that one group is smarter or kinder or more inclined to break the law, for example, based on whether they have red hair or blonde hair, because we don't attach other meaning. Kids don't attach other meaning. So you can perceptually see a group, but not make it a meaningful, unequal group. But that's not what we're doing in society.
So that's the part that is taught, the assignment of meaning to different characters. That makes sense. So we know about the consequences of racism in terms of people being attacked and even killed because of their skin color. But I'm concerned also about the psychological consequences of racism, especially for the victim. So what are some of the psychological consequences of racism for the victims?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a bit of research that shows there are psychological consequences, so things like depression, anxiety, almost like PTSD symptoms. There's also health symptoms, so physical health, and I don't mean in terms of being attacked, but in terms of the stress that happens when you're the target of racism. It does things like increase your cortisol, it increases your heart rate, and we know that those changes put an allostatic load, so kind of a load on our regulatory systems, which are associated with later things associated with inflammatory diseases and diabetes and cancer and heart disease, all of these other health outcomes that come from living in a kind of constant state of stress. So even the psychological damage, as we know, the heart and mind, the mind and the body are really related. And so those kinds of stressors, and they're finding that even in kids in elementary school. So when they're experiencing discrimination at school, it is having physiological and then physical consequences because of that psychological stress.
Does it also affect academic performance?
That's a lot of what my own research looks at, in fact, is looking at all of the academic consequences. So we see this in early as elementary school, is when kids are experiencing racism at school by their peers, by their teachers, by the kind of community at large. They're more likely to, not do as well in school, for one. They also feel a lower sense of what we call school belonging. So they don't feel as valued or as important at the school. And school belonging's really important for a lot of other academic outcomes. You're more likely to stay in school if you feel like you're valued there. So it affects motivation. It affects, kind of self-efficacy. So whether they think that they're a good student or not. And so we know that it shapes kind of how they think of themselves as a student. I don't think society can tell you you're not very smart. and then that you leave school unscathed from that, right? I think, there's that you absorb those types of messages, even when you don't believe them. So the stereotype threat literature shows, when you know the stereotype, even if you don't believe it yourself, it puts downward pressure on how well you're doing at school. It's hard to succeed in the face of all of that.
So how does that work? I mean, if somebody tells you that you're inferior because of your skin color, for example, how does that translate into differences, or how does that affect academic performance?
Well, there's a lot of research, so it kind of depends on the exact way in which it plays out. But what seems to happen is it leads to increases in things like stress. It makes it harder to regulate your emotions. And we know in periods of stress, I think anyone that's ever been a student can say, if you were ever kind of stressed out about something going on, you didn't do as well at school because you're under cognitive load, that cognitive pressure that part of your mind is thinking about the other thing. And it's hard then to do well on a math test or a language arts test, for example. But it also seems to be that, we see that students experience bias from their teachers oftentimes. And teachers are the people that are supposed to be the authorities in how you are as a student. We look to our teachers to see, are we smart in math? Are we smart in science? That's who gives us feedback. That's part of what their job is to give us feedback as students. And so if the person giving you feedback says that you're not very smart in that class, and they can do that in subtle ways. So by not calling on you very often, or by skipping over you instantly if you happen to give the wrong answer, and giving other people more chances to work it out. So through those subtle behaviors, kids internalize the idea that I'm not as smart here. So what we know is if they think I'm not very good at this, then everybody wants to feel good about themselves. So I think if I'm not good in this, I'm going to pull myself away a little bit from caring too much. So I'm going to kind of disengage from this subject and value something else. I still say it's important to do well, but I'm going to make it a little less important. I'm going to work less hard at it because I feel frustrated that I'm never going to succeed in this. So it's all of this stuff combined. It's it's the kind of stress that you're under. It makes it harder to focus. It's the internalizing messages from teachers that say you're not smart. And it's also as a way to maintain your own sense of self, it's how can I think about other things besides this subject so that I'm not constantly feeling frustrated.
It sounds almost as though the child is saying, okay, if you don't like me, I'm not going to like you either.
Yeah, I think we do a lot of that. That's one thing I think is interesting about this is it's consistent with all the other things we know about kids and about people, right? Is that we work really hard to feel okay about ourselves. We're pretty good as humans at maintaining self-esteem, but we have to sometimes do a lot of mental gymnastics to do that. So we have to say, well, if you're not going to like me, here's a group that does, or here's a way that I can cope with it. It's one way we find that one way that is really helpful for kids as a protection, particularly in academics against racism, is to have a strong racial identity. So we talk a lot about that's a really good protector. So feeling positive about your racial group, having your race be an important part of who you are. And so we know that when kids face racism, if they're like, yeah, this is bad, but it's that person that's biased, and I'm proud of who I am and I'm proud of my group, that really helps protect them, particularly academically, but also psychologically from some of the sting of racism.
That's a good point. It also seems like there's some people who react by even going sort of against the structure. So, for example, I remember study by Fordham and Ogre years ago that showed that minority children in Washington, D.C. in high school who were getting low grades then turned around and went against the academic culture, so that they started to actually cause each other to do worse in school by disengaging from the academic system.
Yeah, and I think that research has been pretty supported. There's a lot of variation. And what we found, and kind of what more recent research found, is that it's not as though they're completely devaluing school. Pretty much all kids say, yes, school is important. But they kind of can reattach their own sense of self to other things besides how I'm doing in that math class. And so we do know that kids are pretty subtle about changing what their putting their energy and sense of self into so that they can still feel okay about themselves.
That makes sense. Now, there's a lot of focus on the victims of racism, and certainly it's important to do that. But I'm wondering if there are any negative consequences for the perpetrators of racism.
Well, I think it is limiting in many ways. For one, is if you hold biases about another group, you are preventing yourself from having the experiences that come with having diverse friendships, having diverse interactions. There's a lot of research that shows having diverse friends and people in your environment that are different than you helps with perspective taking, helps with empathy. It helps you have a different point of view, and it helps with problem solving. If people are coming in with different backgrounds, you're more likely to come up with creative solutions. And so if you're biased towards a group, so if you're holding racial biases and not interacting with people that are different, you're cutting yourself off from all of that richness that comes with it, right? And so I think that it is a limiting way to interact with others. And because we know that if you interact with diverse others and have other diversity, have diversity in your environment, your racial biases go down. So, it's this kind of self-sustaining thing. If you prevent yourself from interacting with others, you keep your racial biases intact and your kind of racist views intact, but you're limiting all of the kind of rich, thoughtful, creative experiences you might be having.
I see. Would it be fair to say that it can literally impede one's growth?
Yeah, I think because that's what growth is, right? It's having different experiences. It's thinking, well, how do I get through, nobody grows in a vacuum. And so I think if you don't have different experiences, it's going to completely limit what your growth is. think about travel and how much traveling to like another country, for example, pre-COVID era, but traveling to another country, how enriching that is to see how people live in a different way, to take things from a different perspective, to try food you've not tried, to hear languages you're less familiar with, and how enriching that experience is. You can have it at the small scale too. It's befriending the kid in your classroom that's different than you and talking about your differences, thinking about how might holidays be different, how might family backgrounds be different. That is how you learn. And I think learning is how we grow.
We see then that racism affects the individuals. What about society more generally? Is society harmed by racism?
100%. I think, what it does is it limits people's potential. I think had all kids been educated equally from the beginning of this country, had we had complete equality throughout, how many more discoveries, scientific endeavors, what kinds of diseases would have been cured if the brilliant kids who weren't allowed to have equal opportunities were treated with value, given academic opportunities, not required to live in poverty. When we think about what we could have accomplished if everyone was allowed to work to their potential and was given those kind of supports, it's kind of it's pretty frustrating to think about what could we have done as a country, what kind of art could we have had. And so I think it limits us because it limits people. And I think, people are our greatest resource as a society. And if we're consistently telling one group that you're not as worthy, and we work really hard to limit resources to that one group, then of course we're not going to be at our potential as a society.
So what can parents do to help their children deal with these kinds of biases?
I think one part of it is helping kids have diverse interactions. So, kind of what we've been saying is having diverse interactions is really important. So living in as diverse of neighborhoods as possible, having kids participate in diverse activities and, sports activities or after school activities, finding places where kids can have diverse friendships is a part of it, because we know that's really important. Having diverse and inclusive media in kids' lives is important. For one, we know it helps reduce bias. So it seems to help people have fewer biases if they are consuming diverse media, because they're seeing people that are different. And also kids that are underrepresented. So like kids of color, for example, having diverse media so they can see themselves reflected back is also important, because that helps, again, kind of foster that sense of racial and ethnic identity. You kind of feel connected. You feel less marginalized if you're seeing a world that looks more like you. So that helps both the holder of the bias and the target of bias. I think talking to kids about race is important. So parents of color are typically better at this. They have to be, because that's the reality of racism in the world. But white parents have to talk about racism with their white kids, and talking about how can we fight against racism and be anti-racist. So I think, white kids also need to feel positive about themselves as well. And so for white kids, they really have to focus on how can I be anti-racist? So not being racist is not enough. You got to fight against it, and you got to fight against it in all the ways that you can. So parents are the biggest helpers for that, is to talk to kids about what is racism? How do we spot it? When you notice it, point it out so kids can get like a critical eye for noticing it. That helps them as well.
It seems like an interesting challenge in the sense that a lot of people that are racist don't realize they're racist. I published a book on beliefs, and one of the problems with changing your erroneous beliefs is that you don't know they're erroneous, right?
Yeah. And so I think, and somehow the way I talk about it with parents a lot is to say, this isn't the most scientifically valid answer, but I think it works metaphorically, at least, to say that this is where there's a real disconnect between the heart and the mind. So your heart can really believe that people are equal and that people should be treated equal and that you believe in equality. But your mind has likely made implicit associations and biased pattern activation. Just because you've consumed, 30 minutes of media consumption in America, you're going to see biased patterns. You're going to see racism. And your brain has made those associations. So your mind might have some racist beliefs in there, even though you're not personally believing them. So part of it is doing checks of that. So checking about your own implicit biases, because the reality is most of us have them. And so the difference between people that are kind of what we think of as racist versus not is we all have biased thoughts because we live in a biased world. But the difference is how much effort are we wanting to put into overriding those biases? Are we being mindful and thinking about our biases? Are we slowing down our thinking to think, wait a minute, is that kind of a racist association I'm making? Let me pay attention to the actual situation, not this like really fast gut reaction, which is often going to be one that's informed by racism. So yeah, I think you're right. Most people have racist ideas, but they don't feel racist. But so we just all have to come to terms with that's okay. It doesn't make us bad people. What our job is to override all of those.
Right. It seems like a constant struggle, especially when you have these implicit messages in society, the school system and other structures.
Yeah, I think it is a constant struggle. I mean, I think it's something that you have to think about pretty much every day, to think, let me make sure I'm treating people based on them as individuals and not some assumption I have about them. I think it is very inherent. One reason I talk about the structures so much too in like the book is that I think, this systemic structural biases lead to inequalities and disparities. So it leads to differences in how groups are educated and what kind of poverty rates and what kind of crime rates. Structural racism led to these inequalities. The problem is those inequalities seem to, for a lot of people, just reinforce the racism that they believe and feel, right? So they say, well, this group's not doing as well in America, so it's because they're inferior. And so it kind of just reinforces and strengthens those biases they have. So then they're not motivated to change the bias policies. So I think it's this feedback loop. So I think we have to also recognize that, for example, in most school districts in the country, schools are funded based on the property taxes of the neighborhoods there. And so we have residential segregation. So we have white neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. And the lower income houses feed into those schools, which end up getting much less money than the other ones. So to the tune of millions of dollars less are spent on Black and Latino kids in schools compared to white kids in schools. So not surprisingly, the kids that go to predominantly white schools much better academic outcomes because they had much better funded, better high quality teachers, greater resources. So they're doing better. It's not because one group is inherently better than the other. It's that the structural racism made it so. So it's like we have to kind of also be mindful of when we see differences, what caused the difference? Probably it also goes back to racism too.
So if I understand what you're saying, there's a difference in allocation of resources so that a lot of minority people may not get equal resources compared to majority people. And then because they have fewer resources, they don't do as well. And then everybody comes back and says, well, the fact that you're not doing as well proves that you're inferior and don't deserve it.
Exactly. And so then they're not motivated to change the funding models for schools because they're like, why would we spend more money for people that don't value education?
Right.
So things then stay in place for, hundreds of years.
Wow.
So it's about changing our hearts and minds, changing our policies, and recognizing that the policies are leading to the differences, nothing about the groups themselves.
So as a parent, what are the kinds of sort of internal resources I want to nurture in my child to help him or her deal with racism?
I mean, a big one is, so in terms of, we want to reduce racism in kids is one part of it. So we want to foster things like empathy and perspective taking and compassion. Mm-hmm. Those are really good at empathy, in particular at helping kids not hold racist ideas. Because it's kind of feeling empathetic for others and feeling compassion and thinking about how can I be brave and fight that. For the kids that are the victim or the target of racism, it's helping have that strong sense of their racial identity, feeling proud of it. Having good support systems is important. So like if someone says something to you at school, who can you go talk to? So helping kids have very concrete strategies for if they're called a racial slur at school, which a lot of kids are. Who can they talk to? What can they do? Things like some really interesting research shows that things like a good night's sleep. So Tiffany Ip at Fordham does a lot of research now looking at how a good night's sleep for youth helps them cope with the racism they might experience the next day. So if you sleep well on Monday night and then Tuesday something racist happens, that good night's sleep is predictive of things like not ruminating or thinking over and over about the event that happened, finding good support systems, being able to maintain a kind of positive mood despite that. So like all the stuff we know that's good for just coping and good kind of mental health seems to be good at protecting us from racism as well.
Well, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much more we can talk about. It seems like we've barely scratched the surface and yet our time has run out. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do, but it's a worthy cause, so it's really worth the trouble.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. I think we're all enriched by your sharing with us. For those of you watching today, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.